Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce the Acting Deputy Administrator, Victoria Wassmer.
Thank you very much, Eric. Good afternoon, everyone, and we are really happy to be here. We have a wonderful set of panelists, and we're going to be talking about the drone activities, especially as it relates to stakeholders. As you heard earlier, we really were talking about the FAA's perspective on the internal side, and you can see that this clearly is an agency priority as we think about how to integrate unmanned aircraft systems into our nation's airspace. But we also know that crucial to our success is the close partnerships that we have with industry. Aviation has been an area where we've had close collaborations really since the founding of this really important area of transport and the provision of goods and services. I think as we look at the opportunities that are ahead of us, as well as the challenges that come with integrating drones into our airspace, this collaboration is more important than ever. So I want to take you back to a little story. What happened in 2015? We were looking at unprecedented sales records for small drones, and the agency had at the time been preparing for medium and large drones and the integration of those into our airspace. And so given those forecasts, we had a challenge for us, and this came from the Secretary of Transportation. In mid-October, he challenged us to stand up a small UAS registry in less than 2 months so that we could be ahead of Christmas. So what did we do? We turned to a task force of aviation interests as well as the technology sector to help us understand how to do this better. We got their recommendations and their best thinking. They helped us answer some of the biggest questions we were facing, including what should the registry system look like, how to streamline the data collection process, and how to take into account the user experience, where many of these users had never interacted with the FAA or aviation before. Thanks in large part to their suggestions, we successfully rolled out our online drone registry in less than 2 months. That turnaround time was record for us and fairly unprecedented in government. And as we heard earlier today, there are now more than 770,000 registrations. I think this is a testament to how much can be accomplished when we work together. As we look to the future, the questions that we need to answer on drones are only becoming more complex. And I think from the earlier panel, you got a taste of some of the things that we're grappling with. If we're going to continue to build on our momentum, we at the FAA know that we cannot solve these challenges alone. We need to partner with stakeholders, incorporate their feedback, and ensure that we have mutual learning as we move forward in our shared goals. As Michael mentioned earlier, the FAA has set up several formal structures to make sure that this happens. The Drone Advisory Committee, or the DAC, is helping us to prioritize our drone integration activities, including the development of future regulations and policies. It's made up of representatives from the technology and aviation sectors, labor organizations, and state and local governments. The DAC, its subcommittee, and the working groups have been meeting frequently since September, and they're tackling a number of important issues, including 3 formal taskings. First, how to address the use of drones in low-altitude airspace below 400 feet in populated areas. What are the roles and responsibilities of drone operators, manufacturers, state and local governments? Second, what are the highest priority unmanned aircraft operations? And how can industry best access the airspace to conduct them, given the FAA's risk-based approach to integration? And third, as drones are integrated into the airspace, what are the best ways to cover the cost of public services that are required for the safe and efficient operations of drones? Margaret Jenny is here with us today. She's the president of RTCA, which is the conveyor and the facilitator of the DAC. Thank you, Margaret, for being here. We're also fortunate to be joined by our 2 co-chairs of the Drone Advisory Committee's subcommittee, Brian Quigley, who's the Managing Director and System Chief Pilot of United Airlines, and Nancy Egan, who who is our Senior Advisor of 3D Robotics. The FAA has also chartered the UAS Safety Team to guide our safety work on drones. This was modeled after the highly successful Commercial Aviation Safety Team. This group of aviation and technology stakeholders analyze safety data to identify and address emerging threats that drones may pose to aircraft, people, and property. Ben Marcus, the CEO of AirMap, is here with us today to discuss their progress. Thank you, Finn, for joining us. Finally, we're joined by some FAA experts, our senior team, Hoot Gibson, who is the Senior Advisor for UAS Integration, and Earl Lawrence, who is the Director of our UAS Integration Office. And they're here to talk with you all about how we interact with our industry stakeholders, as well as the research activities that are underway to look at expanded drone operations. Now, I'd like to get the conversation started because I think we're going to have a good one. So the first question I'd like to pose to all of you, and we'll just sort of go down the line if that makes sense, is for you, given that these two different efforts have been stood up less than a year ago, and it's bringing together entities that have not traditionally worked together, what has been your biggest revelation or aha moment as you've been working in your new role as we take on this activity? I'll turn it to you, Margaret.
Thank you, Victoria. Thanks for having me here. As you can see, the tasks that we've been given are not easy. The FAA has not saved anything. They've given us all pretty much the difficult questions, and all of you here, a lot of you here are involved in our groups trying to answer those questions. You know, we've been in the business of consensus building for a lot of years at RTCA in the more traditional aviation world. And it's never that easy. There's a lot of aspects of that have to do with listening and learning. But I have to say, this is an amazing, I would say, clash of cultures. And I think it was even Michael who said this morning, we're not going to change those cultures. But we really do need to take some time to listen to each other and learn from each other. There are some people who think that the traditional manned aviation side is going too slowly, and a lot of people have some preconceived notions about what it means to come to Washington and work inside the Beltway and try to get anything done. And then there's those of us who will go out to Silicon Valley and feel like a fish out of water and feel we'll never be able to go that fast, and that if we do go that fast, that bad things will happen. I will say that to a person on the DAC and on the DAC subcommittee and its task groups, safety is #1 for everyone. I don't see anything other than that in all of our conversations that could never be compromised. It's not going to be good for any of us, especially those trying to get access with new operations. So I think the aha moment is finding ways for us to get through the learning process as fast as we can with the 3 different tasks that we've got underway, understanding. To be able to come up with how to do funding, you need to take some time to understand how the budget process works. To be able to figure out how to get access to the airspace, you've got to get people from very different perspectives to prioritize. So I think what we're working on, and then to try to understand the different roles and responsibilities for the city, the state, the federal government on rules and regulations and enforcement. We are trying to use our time-honored processes in new ways. So that we try to apply what we know works, but we know we've got to do things in new ways. We still are working very hard to have an analytic basis behind any recommendation that goes forward. So we're using some models to help us with that, so that anything that does come from the work groups is very defensible. We can show how we got to the answer. The one thing that we've always known, and it's as true in the DAC as it has been in anything else, is that you have to avoid having the loudest bully in the room win the day. And the way you do that is through using some tools and models to help you come up with what your criteria are for how you're going to make decisions. And then you apply those. And then you have a way to go back and understand how you got to the answer. So Clash of Cultures shouldn't have been an aha moment, but it's going to take some steadied leadership. We're extremely lucky to have Brian and Nancy in those roles of leading these groups through what they've got to do.
Yeah, thank you. which I think, you know, as I step back and think the Drone Advisory Committee has met twice, the DAC subcommittee has met many more times than that in order to ensure that the work that's coming forward as recommendations is fully vetted and that there's a consensus process. And so the folks who are really in the details of that are Brian and Nancy, and I'd love to hear from you both about that revelation or aha moment for you personally as leaders of the subcommittee work.
So let me step back just a little bit, and I'll explain kind of the different levels of work that's being done and then kind of build on what Margaret said. So about a year ago, the FAA launched the Drone Advisory Committee, which is a federal advisory committee, and then below the Drone Advisory Committee, there's a subcommittee which does a lot of they receive the tasking from the Drone Advisory Committee, and then we have assigned to 3 task groups work that are basically answering questions that have been asked of the Drone Advisory Committee and the subcommittee. So there's an incredible amount of talent from many stakeholders that are participating not only on the subcommittee, but also on the task groups. And in my day job, as Victoria mentioned, I'm really focused on airline safety. And all of you that climbed into the back of an airplane to come here today, I appreciate that. When I was the reason why I was asked to do this job, I think, is largely not because of my manned aircraft role, but because I had participated a lot on some federal advisory committees, other consensus type work with the FAA and other organizations. And so when we were going through that courting process, largely with Earl and Margaret and Victoria, the way that questions were posed to me, I was concerned that I was really going to be the outsider in this work, coming from an airline and knowing the work that all of the UAS providers and companies that are involved in that space are looking at things. And the cultural aspects of that challenge, I thought were going to be largely manned versus unmanned. And I really see it differently now that I've had the opportunity to work with Nancy and others on the subcommittee. And there's many other kind of diverse aspects to the type of work that you're doing that make this a challenge. And it's not so much the kind of the disparate focus between manned and unmanned. It's more the work that you do in your day jobs as you try to bring these systems to the marketplace. And that's many people that are working on the task groups in the subcommittee kind of follow a couple of different paths. One is that they're in operations and they're trying to integrate systems to be able to bring UASs into the national airspace system. There's a whole other group of folks that are regulatory, governmental affairs, or congressional affairs type people that are trying to understand what the rule set is, and also in different lobbying capacities trying to influence the government on how we're going to get this stuff to the marketplace sooner. And so as we're having these discussions, the folks that are involved in the work that we're doing on the task groups are largely thinking about what they do in their day jobs, and it's kind of a constant realignment, not only for me, but as we try to influence others, to ensure that we're all trying to do the same thing from a consensus standpoint, and consensus is really hard. So there's just, Nancy might have been going to do this, so I hope I don't steal your thunder. Can I just have a show of hands of folks that are in the audience that are working on the DAC subcommittee? Okay, so quite a few of you, so thanks for being here.
Thank you. Nancy.
You did not steal my thunder. But I'd also like to see, can we have a show of hands of everyone who's been on one of the task force, registration task force, the flight over, or the micro arc, and the DAC subcommittee? I think we'll have lots more. There are lots of people who are engaged in various ways. As to my aha moment happens each time we meet, that there are so many aha moments, and that everybody's willing to have aha moments. So I do think we have a group of people who are very open-minded and need to be very open-minded coming in to hear what other folks have to say. I do think the groups, the culture clash has subsided over even the last 2 years. And not because one side's changing and the other isn't, is that people are coming to understand the point of view of others. I think where we've really converged is that everybody understands that safety and innovation are really important, and we agree on that. We agree on little else when we start, but we move along. I just want to illustrate, you brought up the registration task force, and just to show you how far apart we all started. We had a call before even the first meeting, and it was for FAA to just describe the rules to the whole group. Towards the end of the call, Dave Voss, who came from Google, new entrant, Dave Voss said, okay, everyone, I want you all to be really comfortable, wear jeans and t-shirts, let's have a really great working day. And over the speakerphone came the voice of Earl Lawrence. The FAA will be wearing suits and ties. Very much illustrated where we were starting, pretty far apart. But I think we have moved. There's a lot of work to do, but we have moved a lot closer together.
Thank you, Nancy. Ben, can you share with us about the UAS safety team? I know you guys have a meeting coming up this Thursday, and you've met several times already, but it's still also a new entity.
Yeah, thank you, Victoria, and it's great to be here with all of you. As Victoria said, I'm here today in my capacity as the industry co-chair of the Unmanned Aircraft Safety Team. Earl is the other co-chair from the FAA side, and the UAST is a industry FAA partnership, and we're taking data to help deliver safety enhancements for the UAS industry. This is modeled after the Commercial Aviation Safety Team, CAST, as well as the General Aviation Joint Steering Committee, GAJSC. But I think the big aha for us as a team has been that there are some significant differences this time compared to the previous two. And I would just categorize those in two areas. First of all, we don't really have any data to work with yet. Mm-hmm. Our task is to develop safety enhancements that are data-driven, and the team is very collaborative and pushing aggressively forward. But the first step is to develop the data, because we don't have that corpus of data to draw from. And so the members of the team have been working very hard to develop structured methods for collecting this data so that it can actually be used in a meaningful way. The second big aha is that we're trying to reach a whole new audience of operators that aviation hasn't really touched before. And we're trying to draw a whole new generation of aviators, of pilots, right, into our safety culture that we all benefit from as the traveling public or as aviators. So that's also not something that either CAST or GAJSC have had to do before. So communications is an important element of what UAST is all about. So those are sort of my two big takeaways. Quickly, I just wanted to say thank you to the 50 or so members who are contributing so actively. Thank you to our FAA partners. And we are making very good progress. We'll actually launch a website in the next couple of weeks, so anybody can go there and see what we're up to. And you'll be seeing lots from us in 2017.
Great, thank you very much.
I guess I would partner with everyone else. There's probably been more than one aha moment as we've continued along course. I think, yes, Clash of Cultures comes to mind. Evolution. Maybe some of you that know me know I have a history with the Air Force, retired Air Force fighter guy. We went through this about a decade ago in earnest, and you can imagine that was a clash of cultures, the unmanned systems, and then coming up with a whole new career field. So it's not completely new to me. It was somewhat expected. I think the real aha moment, though, as we've drifted along here and entertaining with all of you in this room today at different points of time, is the recognition that we're really not going to get anywhere except as a community. We have our differences, and we're working through that, and this is some of the pain and strife. But I think that recognition, and then being an old Air Force aviator, I do draw back sometimes to historical references. And I think some of you have heard me say this is the most fundamental change in aviation in our lifetimes. But there's been other times, Orville and Wilbur come to mind, but a lot of the military development transposing and moving over to commercial aviation, this is a real opportunity for all of us, and some of it has been mapped along the way. I've said to some of the folks, you know, if you love aviation, and I think just about everybody does in here, in one form or another, that we all trace some of our DNA back to Orville and Wilbur in the sense of innovation and, you know, how to model the risk and do it safely, though, as we've come so far today. We all know we put our friends and families, thanks to Brian down there and others, on our aircraft, and we never even think twice these days about them getting where they're going to go. We get upset if they're 10 minutes late. So we got to take that kind of model, bring it over and overlay it with some sense of innovation, and then accept it as a community with this generation and how we're going to move it ahead safely.
Thank you. Earl.
It's
Mike.
great if you had a mic.
Yes, there's great if we had a mic. Great to be here and see this huge crowd here. When Hoot Gibson and I came into the agency in the UAS role, I think one of the first things we thought of is how are we going to get millions of drone operators to all collaborate and work on one set of rules, and that's quite a challenge. And the things that I always think about is, you know, the pace of innovation. What technology and what drones were being sold last week are different next week. Not next year, next week. The volume of operations, as we've been hearing, we're just not used to in the FAA dealing with the numbers that we're dealing with, and it just changes even the basic systems that we have, and the personal nature of the drones themselves. Certainly, we've been thinking big aircraft; they're up high, but things in your backyard is kind of a new experience to us all, and it was really that the realization that we're not just integrating, as Hoot likes to say, into the FAA or into the NAS, but we are integrating into society a whole new technology. And there's no way we're going to do that without a lot of help. And that's, you know, when I was looking at the millions, how are we going to get all the help that we need to make this happen? And to do this, we needed to focus on some keystones, and I see it, all of us talking about this today. Safety, shared accountability, and collaboration, and just all of us working together. So this event last year, and ever since last year, we set up the DAC and the unmanned aircraft safety team and 2 ARCs. I just wanted to highlight the importance it is to the FAA that we have that realization that there's no way we are going to integrate a new technology into society without all of your help and with these key people up here today.
Great, thank you. So just for anybody in the audience who wants to ask a question, I will be looking periodically, and since the last panel had 200, we are trying to do better than that, but they had a longer time, so we'll just see how it goes. One of the things that we talked about as we were preparing for this is the idea of what's our tolerance for risk. And it's been an area in the Drone Advisory Committee discussions that got brought up pretty early on. And I think at the FAA, obviously, we have a compliance philosophy, and we have a phased-in approach that's looking at the lower risk and integrating that in terms of the regulatory framework. But at the same time, I think one of the things that we have been pushed by, especially our Silicon Valley friends and colleagues, because they're just in a different place as they evaluate how to address risk. And it's clearly something that Peggy Gilligan, who is the head of the Office of Safety at FAA, was talking about. It needs to make sure, how we integrate needs to ensure that we maintain the current level of safety or better. So I'm gonna just turn over that sort of interesting question about risk and throw it out there. I think, Brian, you may have had some thoughts about this when we were talking earlier.
Yeah, so appreciated Peggy's comments, and so like Hoot, I come from a military background, and I look at the question of risk management. It's not too long ago that the FAA didn't use the term risk because they didn't think that the flying public wanted to hear that term. So everything was focused on safety, but you know, safety is just one of those words where it's hard to evaluate or measure. So when you're talking about risk management, you identify a hazard, which is a condition which is could cause death, injury, damage, and then you measure it in terms of severity and probability, and then you mitigate that risk to the lowest acceptable level. So the question was asked at the previous panel, do we accept the same level of risk for UASs as we do for manned aviation? Peggy talked a little bit about smaller aircraft, personal use, pleasure flying aircraft having a kind of a different risk level. And I think and the way I look at this is that the way you measure that risk determines how much tolerance you have. So if we're talking about a micro UES hitting the windshield of a car, then the measurement of that risk, the severity of that event is not going to be that great. But if you take a Predator MQ-9 size UAS and impact the same windshield, then the severity can be much, much different. And so I think that there's a lot of things that this community can learn from manned aviation. And when we first started this dialogue on the subcommittee, my feeling coming from the manned world was there was a little bit of opposition to what we had done in the manned world, because you look back over 114 years when the Wright brothers were flying to today, and the pace of innovation just doesn't seem to be as great as it has been in the last couple of years for the UAS world. But to me, they're completely separate models. And a lot of the work that we're doing on the subcommittee for the DAC was referenced or mapped to what the Next Gen Advisory Committee was doing. And there was a feeling that the Next Gen Advisory Committee perhaps wasn't moving at the pace that the drone folks would like to. And so, a couple of comments I had heard were that they're just risk averse. There's no tolerance for risk in the manned world. And to be honest with you, that's not true. We manage risk, a huge amount of risk, every day. And we do it with the great folks from the FAA, Terry's organization and ATO, Peggy's organization, who help us understand how to manage that risk. And we do it with compliance philosophy, which you've heard a little bit about today. We assume that when aviators climb in the cockpit to carry you around the world, that they're going to understand what the rules are, they're going to be willing, and they're going to be able to comply with them. And that's the same thing that I would expect from anybody that's flying a drone. And I would expect that everybody that's going to do that understands that there's certain conditions that you can cause while operating that drone that can be incredibly risky behavior. So that's what we have to manage too.
Ben, I'm thinking that this is an area, especially as you talked about the fact that we don't have that much data yet, how to grapple with those kinds of questions.
Yeah, actually, this is a real challenge for UAST because we don't have any real accidents to analyze. Thankfully, it's today UAS are pretty safe. At AirMap, we provide an airspace management platform for drones, and we're providing services for more than 100,000 flights per day. I believe there's about 60,000 manned aircraft flights per day right now, so we're already seeing a lot more activity, and you just don't hear about fatalities, right? So I think we're starting in a good place, and the work that all of us are doing together is to try to solve for increasing risk over time. We want to enable more types of use cases over time, and really help this technology become a part of daily life in society, right? So as I actually think that the unmanned aircraft industry is evolving in a somewhat similar fashion to how the manned aircraft industry started. After the Wright brothers first flew, the first real tangible application for airplanes was in the military, right? Then, World War I pilots came home with surplus airplanes, became barnstormers, and were having fun with airplanes. And it was only later that the commercial airlines, became something that we now take for granted. So a lot of lessons were learned in the military space. A lot of lessons were learned in the recreational space, right? And yeah, there was a lot of damage done, and a lot of people died along the way. But today we benefit from all of those lessons as a traveling public, and I think the UAS space is evolving, where obviously the military has been using drones for a long time. There's been quite a lot of scale around recreational operations in the last few years. We're moving into an enterprise phase where businesses want to use drones for things like industrial inspection and at scale, right? There have been a lot of sort of smaller experiments in that area, but we want to really make that scalable. And ultimately, a few years from now, we're going to move into what I call a consumer phase, which is actually not people flying drones for fun, but actually benefiting from goods and services that are delivered by this technology to them in their daily lives. So how do we model a risk management protocol, right, that addresses those future use cases? How do we really allow these things to be a part of people's daily lives without creating any undue risk to them? And I think that's what we're all working toward.
I think what you just shared is very much in keeping with what Earl was talking about, which is we're talking about how do we integrate this into our society, and the broader questions in relations to society's acceptance, and really it's a change management process as well as a technology challenge to do that. Any others that'd like to speak to this question?
I was just thinking, Orville and Wilbur they understood risk. They had risk mitigation. Obviously their level of risk was quite a bit higher than today. But for example, they never both flew at the same time. So there was some amount of understanding of you had to manage the risk, or the whole thing would be done. We do have in the work that we've done at RTCA for standards for the maybe larger UAS, and some of the leaders are in the room today. Rose Mooney here from SC203, and I think Paul McDuffie and Rick Heinrich from SC228, who are developing standards for detect and avoid and command and control to allow some of the larger UAS to get into the airspace and the more military applications. There's a process that is used to look at the risk, look at the hazards, do the hazard analysis, using NASA to do a lot of the validation of the standards, so that when we get done, we know that it's going to meet just the amount of there's going to be just the right amount of risk, and the standards themselves are performance level, moving to risk-based standards. So what we've got, I think we can try to take some of that and apply it with albeit a much different level of risk for some of what you're trying to do in here. But there are some approaches that I think have been tried over time that could be applied here.
Just two quick kind of offline things, in the sense that I had a group come to me recently that wanted to fly blood, basically, so a noble cause. And but at the end of their routing, which they stayed out of, urban traffic, they eventually had to come across the highway. And of course, everybody gets tense when that happens. But it comes back to things that we do now, which is reliability data, right? So if we could get reliability data, we would know, what's the chance of that vehicle. But as Earl said, this stuff changes every week, and certainly you don't have a vehicle that you're collecting on more than a year, probably, right? And even then, it's probably had new engines and new whatever, motors. So trying to build that database, besides gathering the data, the vehicle itself and the industry itself is evolving in a way that's kind of hard to kind of water skiing behind it, but at least we know where we need to get to with data. And I think the other thing that folks are starting to socialize, or have been for a while, and I don't know, I'd love to have a discussion on how viable, but a number of the things that we're looking to replace manned operations with, power line inspections, and some of the more dangerous things, even going up in cell towers and whatnot, is using this more as a tool, if you will, to augment that and make it safer to the person, to the individual. I don't know that we have that in our equation anywhere, and maybe we shouldn't, but I'd love to hear. You all can approach me later on that if you want, but I think that's just two unusual aspects of this safety equation, if you will.
I'll just add, we've been going up and down, and I see I have an engineering degree too. We always tend to go diving into that technical nature, and we're going to go to SMS and all this. But we talked about what's socially acceptable risk. How many people are going to be happy with a drone coming through their living room plate glass window on a regular basis? Okay, how often is it going to be until somebody in that city or that town says that's an unacceptable level of safety? We didn't talk about an injury. We didn't talk about a fatality. It's just the fact I don't want these things flying through my window. Society is going to decide this. We don't get to decide what the acceptable level of risk is going to be. And I think this is one of the challenges. I know they come to the FAA all the time. Well, just tell us what the level of risk is. Well, the level of risk is acceptable when Congress isn't passing a law or your local town isn't passing an ordinance or anything like that, because what you're doing, how you're acting and how you're behaving at a personal level as an operator isn't unacceptable to everyone. And that's one of the challenges on the UAST as well, is what data, as we're looking at data, it's not just the normal groupings of data. But we're now starting to gather some of this stuff, and we're having the phenomenon I'm starting to see is we're actually getting more reports from, quote, victims than we are from the drone operators who don't want to tell us what happened, but the society who was affected by it do want to tell us. So this is something that it's going to be a new dynamic for us all.
I have a couple of questions here that came in from the audience, and I want to tie in a little bit to this area. One of the things that we do track and we report on is the number of sightings by pilots near airports and otherwise. And so the question came in, are you concerned about the number of UAS sightings reported to the FAA by pilots near airports?
Yes.
Yes.
Next question.
I'll just start the conversation from the pilot perspective, especially. But for most of my adult life, I was trying to see rather large aircraft, and it was still difficult. I think we will continue, perhaps in our upgrading of surveillance systems and things that give us really some objective data, to struggle with what it equates to a sighting, because frankly I look at, not to be dismissive, but I go, boy, I don't know. That's a tough one. I would say in my mind, though, where there's smoke there's fire. 1% of 10,000 is one number. 1% of a couple 100,000, you're starting to get concerned either way. And so we'll continue to struggle. I know Earl and our safety shops are working on how to do that, but it's one of those things, damned if you do, damned if you don't, as far as you're trying to get your arms around it. But if it's imperfect, then people take exception with that too.
In fact, this ties into another question, and Ben, I'm going to ask you, as the UAS safety team strives to be data-driven, what type of data is being sought, hoping that there won't be a reliance on traditional accident data?
Yeah, so there are two elements that we're sort of trying to answer, right? One is a numerator, which is how many incidents are actually happening, and another is the denominator, how many flights are happening, so that we can start to really get a handle for the scope of the problem, right? So those are the two broad categories of things that we're looking for. Specifically, some examples of the numerator. How do we know about some kind of an occurrence? One would be a report from an operator. Another could be a report from a member of the public. It could be an official accident report, accident investigation that's ongoing. There's lots of different categories of this data that we're seeking. On the denominator side, we're looking for data that's similar to what the airlines have been collecting from flight operations quality assurance, right? So how do you sort of collect a broad corpus of operational data that's not just about incidents, but actually how these things are operating more broadly? We have a group within the UAST that's working with large operators who have already volunteered a lot of this data, manufacturers who have already volunteered a lot of this data, keeping in mind what are the concerns around privacy, what sort of opt-ins do we need from operators, how do we aggregate this data and anonymize it so that it can be used without giving any particular competitive advantage to any one person and so forth. So these are all the kinds of things that we're looking at with our data task group.
I'll just add a little bit more as we're looking at this data, and going back to the airport question. How did those drones get there that the pilot saw them on approach to the airport? Now, I actually believe that the vast majority of them were not there because somebody actually purposely put them there. There may be a few. We all see YouTube. But the majority of them got there because somebody lost control of that aircraft. Or they just have no idea where they're operating. And I think this is one of the things I know the UAST, this is one of the first questions we reached out to the community and we started asking, have you ever lost control and why? And so that's where we're starting to dig in. I mean, now it's really at high level data. When people, actually a rather small number reported back on the last survey that we did that said they lost control. But let's just, I'm making it up now. Let's just say 10%. Well, if it's 10% of 2 million aircraft lost control, that's a lot of opportunities to run, be sighted in the wrong place and be operated in the wrong place. The operator doesn't want to lose it. So what are we going to do? Let's work with the manufacturers. And I think we've seen a lot of actions already taken by the manufacturers to make their aircraft more reliable, to lessen the chances, to put in things like the auto land, the return to home. How did we do those things? It's that continuous learning. And I think this is the things that we're doing in the UAST is we're sharing those items that we've learned and said, okay, well, this is how I program my return to home. And oh, by the way, I had somebody, it went to return to home because they lost link and it hit the building on the way back because it didn't know the building was there. Oh, okay, so let's change our return to home so that that goes back the same way that it came. Well, that's a nice software upgrade. And these are the kind of things that, just like in manned aviation, we're having that dialogue, we're changing the programming, sharing it among the different manufacturers, and updating things. So, again, it's just a little bit of a improvement in safety, and hopefully it returns back someplace close to home and not on the approach to O'Hare or wherever it may be.
Mm-hmm. Nancy, I had a question and was just talking about how quickly and rapidly change is happening in the manufacturing arena for drones, and that it's at a much faster clip than we have traditionally been used to in sort of legacy manned aircraft. And in relation to that, I think we talked a little bit about behavioral economic constructs and how do we incentivize the kinds of behaviors we would want operators to have in utilizing these technologies. And I thought you could just share from your perspective what kinds of things you guys are talking about within that sector.
Well, it's slightly different in the manned aviation world because in the manned aviation world you have self-preservation, and that's a big influencer. In the drone world, you often have just an investment, right? You have their $1,600 drone, and people don't want to lose them. And if you look at YouTube and all the chat rooms and things, you see people like, is it okay to fly over water? Because I don't want it to, there aren't any people there, but I don't want to destroy my drone. On the product cycle, when you say manufacturing, this isn't like aircraft manufacturing, right? It's hardware and it's software. And you can change the software very quickly. So someone can buy a drone and keep it for several years and get updates. And new releases, major feature releases can come out every 2 months, every 6 weeks. Some things like switching to rewind, you might say that is a great idea. We only need another 2 weeks to push that out. And you can push rewind to things that you manufactured a year ago. So it's sort of a very different cycle. You don't have to wait long periods of time. You don't have to change your hardware to change the way that something can work. And the drone folks insist on it, because if you're not pushing out the latest and greatest, you also don't have that cost of changing. If product A doesn't keep up and you're not pushing out those software releases and those safety products, they can move pretty quickly to product B.
It occurs to me, we've talked a lot about kind of the history of manned aviation and back when the Wright brothers jumped into the airplane together. There was limited uses on what an aircraft was going to be for. The folklore going back to Icarus is that man wanted to fly, but there wasn't really an understood commercial application for the aircraft itself. Quickly went to the military. After that, we had a lot of airplanes sitting around, so we figured out what to do with them. You know what you want to do with drones, though. You know what commercial applications you want. And so you can design into these devices the things that you think you need, and also the risk mitigation methodologies to enable that. So you've got kind of a leg up on manned aviation and the historical perspective, the historical past that we have with manned aviation, because you can design through the hardware and software that Nancy's talking about to enable you to use your device in places that have inherent risk in them.
So we actually had a question that was on this point, and Earl, I think this is a good one perhaps for you. Is there a working group that's addressing manufacturing requirements, regulations, and restrictions? For example, software, geofencing, and downloadable flight restrictions.
I'm actually going to ask Nancy. You want to take this one?
So I would say yes, but indirectly, not defined exactly as such. So not defined in those sort of, I would consider those traditional words, and everything's open for innovation, including the words we use and the methods we follow. So instead, what the task groups are doing is saying, what's the problem we're trying to solve? And for example, airspace management. How will we face that? Not what manufacturing restrictions will we put on something, but how will we, in a holistic way, get people into the airspace? Another category is equipage. What equipage would be helpful? What performance standards would be helpful? So rather than starting from a manufacturer will be responsible for X, Y, and Z, we're saying what holistically should be happening, and then how do we solve that problem? Is it a user problem? Is it a manufacturer problem? Is it an equipage? Is it a third-party piece of equipment? Will that not work? So it's much more holistic than are you working on requirements and certification requirements. I think the better way to state it is we're trying to solve problems and expand operations to continue to ensure safety.
Open source drone code?
Well, exactly. So that's another a wonderful thing about software. You have something like drone code, which happens to, Chris Anderson, the CEO of 3DR, is also the president of drone code. It's open source. It invites all of the community to create features. It allows a lot more testing than any individual company can do. I mean, it's out, they test daily, weekly. People are out doing lots of cool things, and it can change radically and quickly. So do we need a big certification process, or could we use drone code, which is a consortium, and lots of you here are in that consortium? Could we use something like drone code, which is a direct industry consortium, to say, look, if you use this nugget, I'm using the words improperly, I'm not a software person, I'm a policy person. If you use this kernel, we know that it has certain safety features, and we've all agreed if you don't touch these bits, you can do X, Y, and Z. So that's a different way to create, maybe it's not called certification, but it's a different way to say we've met certain standards.
Right, and I think from that, one of the questions that came up was, how can FAA even begin to start to regulate in this area? And I think you struck that point about a performance standard approach.
Well, and the other point is, one of the things we're talking about here is collaboration. So we say, how does the FAA even begin to regulate? Maybe we need to say, how do we all get moving in regulating ourselves through something like drone code and consortiums and things? And we can say, look, this is safe. We've all worked on this together. So I think we can change that question a bit.
Okay, very good. One of the things that came up earlier in the questions from the audience was to ask about who represents the Defense Department, in particular related to services that they are utilizing in this area. And I thought that might be a good one for you to touch upon.
Oh, yeah, good point. Earl just mentioned XCOM. Brief comment. In 2009, when the struggle continued between the FAA and integration, and where the military was hitting some break points as far as, we needed more airspace, I was actually on the other side of the street at that time, and language came out establishing a UAS XCOM executive committee by language that said the FAA need to work with DoD to figure this out, and that was again in 2009, chartered 2010. I now chair that august group. Earl runs the SSG, which is where all the work gets done, but we've got a lot of crossflow, and most of you, most recently anyway, and we'll have a breakout tomorrow on it, is we're addressing a lot of the security concerns now as this technology ramps over. And not surprisingly, we saw it first on the DoD side, but it's a concern now. So as we move towards safety, and we now have safety and security, which often are related, but that we have to do that. DoD, though, is engaged very closely through the XCOM, but also through the PBFA, and I think every office in here from the FAA has some connection directly into the Pentagon and the services.
There's a question that came up that's asking about what's our beyond visual line of sight policy.
Beyond visual line of sight policy, we have a whole forum on that tomorrow. We'll get into the details. But I like to remind everybody, guess what? Beyond visual line of sight happens on a daily basis within our national airspace system. And I like to remind everybody, when Peggy was sitting up here, she says, you reminded everyone, our rules there are rules. You can go certify the aircraft, certify the pilots, get authorization. We just know that those rules aren't really tailored for this new community, and that's why we're working to address it. But that's why it's interesting when people say beyond line of sight. Beyond line of sight could mean I'm standing on top of the bridge and the UAS is below me inspecting the bridge. That's beyond line of sight. Beyond a line of sight can also mean an aircraft at 60, 70,000 feet halfway around the world, or it could be a balloon, up in the air and doing surveillance or providing communication. It means a lot of different things. And so when you say, what's our policy? Just like in manned aviation, there isn't just one policy. It goes back to, what are you doing? There's one policy if you're operating and you're looking at the bridge and you're standing on top of it. It'll be another policy if you're doing a farm field, like we've done with our Pathfinder programs, and you're inspecting a couple thousand acres in a local area and you know what's going on there, and it's going to be a whole nother thing if you're transporting blood. A distance of 10 miles or something to some island out there for an emergency. It's going to mean another thing if you're inspecting national infrastructure and a natural disaster, and it'll mean another thing if you are carrying people around. Which I keep saying it's not unmanned if you're carrying people around, but it seems that this community is looking forward to moving to fully automated aircraft and moving people around, and we'll talk about that more tomorrow. So, it's not a single answer. It's what are the risks, just like we've been talking about, and how do you address those? How are you going to ensure safety of that operation for the non-participating public? And that's really what it's all about. And we rely on the accountability of all the applicants that come forward with, this is how we're going to do this. I'll ask the panel. I think it'll be really good to hear what they think of, how do you approach the FAA with something? I have lots of folks, I can tell you, I have a whole different attitude when you come in with a whole new project and the first thing you talk about is safety, or the first thing you talk about is how much money you're going to make. I'm the FAA, I'm the safety regulator. What's most important to me?
Yeah, and I think I think Nancy started talking a little bit about the way that one of the task groups is looking at getting access to the airspace is dividing itself. So there are 5 different groups, and one's looking at beyond visual line of sight for commercial, one's looking at beyond visual line of sight for small, and then there's one looking at equipage and looking at where we go in the future. But I would expect within the year we'll be coming back with some recommendations back to the FAA, and they'll be focused on specific missions and operations in those spaces, and probably going in an evolutionary way with the lowest risk first, and in evolving. So that's the way the group right now is really trying to tackle it and come back with recommendations.
I want to touch on a question Earl just asked about how to approach the FAA. You're interested in people, and I've now been approaching the FAA for 2 years, and sort of the evolution of Nancy's approach to the FAA is where, we first went in and just really thought, our product is so cool, how can you not be wowed and impressed by this product? And here, do you want to try it? And we're really struck by people saying, I'm not even going to touch that thing. I don't, it looks very neat, but I don't want to touch it. And Earl and his team have done a great job, and with great patience and humor and smiles, to say, here's what we're interested in. We're interested in safety. And we'll hear you out, but talk to us about safety. So you come about 2 years later, and I went into a meeting with a bunch of folks from Earl's team and talked about safety. Here we have this challenge, and we know that it doesn't fit within the current operational approvals of Part 107. How should we approach this? And the FAA's creative thinking, the folks saying, hey, what if you tried this, maybe this? And there's such amazing amount of knowledge the FAA has, and they are completely willing to share, and in my experience have been completely creative and innovative about how to meet the requirements. But you have to be very focused, and we're trying to meet the requirements because we understand that this is a safety case that we're trying to make. So it's been an interesting evolution. I think but we're getting new entrants every day, and I think you guys will probably continue to have to smile and say the same things over and over again for a while. But you're good at it.
There's a theme that's popped up about people who want to get involved, people who are very eager and enthusiastic, and they're asking about the various committees as well as just how to work locally. So I think that's an interesting question. Just wanted to throw it out to the group.
Well, I mean, I can start. Certainly, there's been a lot of collaboration between RTCA and the FAA leadership team, Earl and Victoria and their team, on how to get involved in what we're doing. RTCA operates, as you know, federal advisory committees for the FAA. They're designed by law to be open and transparent. All the meetings are open to the public. All the plenary meetings are open to the public. We try to describe on the website what's going on with what's coming up, what's being addressed by the committees. Anyone who has an interest can contact us. And there is a process now that we've developed with the FAA. FAA actually developed and we've been using now, which is we'll compile and listen to anyone who has an interest in becoming involved. We'll ask for a certain amount of information about your background, what you think you bring to the table, and on a periodic basis, we will sit down with the FAA and evaluate those who want to get involved. If it's at the DAC subcommittee level or the task group level, Brian and Nancy will be heavily involved in looking at that. And as we then look at who would get involved, we're going to be looking at a number of criteria. Some of which were mentioned this morning. As people step off, any of the committees will look for what gaps that might create, or as we get new tasks, we'll look at what gaps are created there and actually go out and look for that kind of expertise. Or we would expect someone to explain to us why they think they're filling a gap. We are constantly going to then step back further and make sure that what we've done continues to have full balance of representation, and there isn't one segment that's getting out of balance in terms of who's on the committee. We try to bring in people who can represent larger groups of stakeholders. And then finally, once we are making the final decision on specific people for these committees, there are a number of criteria we will look at, and that is your proven ability to be a part of the consensus process, and your willingness to be actually part of the building of the products, doing the work, coming to the meetings, and then being held accountable for the consensus that comes out the other end. So there's a lot that comes with that, becoming a part of the process. There's a lot of accountability that comes along with that, that all of us sitting up here, look at and monitor pretty much on a weekly basis. Right now, we're very lucky to have an amazing group of subcommittee task groups of people who are working, all who have day jobs, who are coming on sometimes a weekly basis. It's a pretty big commitment to become involved at the level of being on one of the groups. There are a lot of other ways to see what's going on and observe what's going on, coming to plenary meetings and even having a chance to weigh in. So lots of different ways to get involved. Let us know, and that starts the process.
I would just offer, and it's great that Brian's here, but his organization that helped sponsor this today, I think the grassroots piece continues to be where a lot of the, as it were, wars are fought out there. We had a conversation earlier today, and it's something that I've seen for the last decade. is education is the basis of all these debates and discussions. A lot of folks don't understand this technology. A lot of them don't appreciate it. They don't want it around. And so besides coming back, as Margaret outlined, and participating back here in DC at the technical level, I think the grassroots effort is where a lot of the significant discussion and education takes place. So I've spoken at a number of Brian's chapters out there. I know that's one of the many grassroots efforts that's fundamental to turning the tide, if you will, on the education.
Yeah, I think Brian was talking about the remote pilot councils and that collaboration and participation by some key folks within our Office of Safety to ensure that information is being spread about the standards and professionalism of what's required. Earl, I saw you want to jump in here.
Oh, well, it's just building upon the AUVSI chapters, you know, and we need to encourage people to join groups and participate. You know, America is really based on a lot of volunteerism. AMA, you know, if you're a consumer or a recreational person, encourage them to join an AMA chapter and get active at the AMA field. We do have the AUVSI drone code. If you're a coder, you know, I mean, you can just join in on those coding sessions and participate in developing a better set of code. Set up your own safety group if you're working commercially in your local area. This is the way everything in society has been developing over the years. It's not everything run to DC and be on all these, you know, committees or whatever. Those are great things, but as we know, everything is driven, you know, on the ground by the operators, and it's the actions that everybody takes, and peer pressure goes a long way. You know, and that's really what we need. We need people out there showing that example, teaching others. And you know, we have the FAA FAST team. It's going out and doing education. You can actually, you know, become a FAST team counselor with the FAA and help educate operators in your area of what are the rules and how you can operate. All these things really do make a big difference. So I can't stress that enough. And you know, take advantage of all the different tools that are out there. It isn't just about sending something to the FAA. It's join all the various groups that are out there trying to advance this industry.
Increasingly, as we heard a little about this morning, it's not going to be the FAA who comes to tell you you've done something wrong, right? So it's becoming increasingly local. And one way to really rile up your city council is to have a lot of mishaps and to have operators in your area who don't know the rules, who don't fly within the rules. So the further down we push the culture of compliance, the easier everybody's lives become, because we perhaps avoid this patchwork of local laws where people say, you know what, we now get it. Drones are good. We like saving the lives of the guys climbing the tower and inspecting the wires and inspecting the bridges, and we know there's a societal good there. And they're really not so annoying, and we'll deal with them. But we've got to get to the local level to make that happen.
Ben, on the UAS safety team, what are sort of the ways that people can get involved?
Yeah, so we're similar to the RTCA process in some ways, but very different in others. We're not a federal advisory committee, so we have a bit more flexibility. This really is an industry-driven group. We have, as I mentioned earlier, about 50 volunteer members and organizations that are contributing to our safety work. You know, these individuals and companies and organizations span all types of manufacturing and operational scenarios, manned aviation community, air traffic control community, and so forth. So if you are interested in joining, we are looking for folks who bring safety expertise, who are committed to actually doing the hard work. We require everybody to participate in a working group and actually contribute. We do move the meetings around. They're not just here in DC, but all around the country. So if you're interested in learning more, you can speak to Earl, myself, or Derek Hufty, who's our executive secretariat within the FAA.
There's a series of questions, and it's sort of an interesting one, that are talking about, are we concerned about the safety and specifically mechanisms to ensure that maritime facilities remain secure? So there's a whole series of questions around security over ships, ships especially that carry large numbers of people, and how to prevent accidents in that regard. Never heard that one before, so throwing it out there.
Well, it sounds like critical infrastructure type things, right? So we're concerned about, I think people are concerned generally about safety of most things. And I think tomorrow you're having your section on counter UAS and
UAS security.
UAS security.
I think we've always talked about, in that instance, especially because we're having to address the law and how we move forward with that, but fixed sites. So this is an area where it's actually sites that are in movement.
Mobile. You know, besides, you know, we're currently involved in 2206 was the language, and that's protection in and around airports, and that makes total sense that the FAA would be looking into that. We're doing it with our federal partners. Most of you know that DoD is concerned, of course, about their bases. DOE is concerned about their energy sites, so on and so forth. But I would add that Major League Baseball is worried about their ballparks, and the NFL, NC2A, NASCAR, Disney. So there's a lot of corporate work that's ongoing as well. Some of that mobile, but a lot of it, of course, is just protection of large gatherings of people. I would argue all of them are worried about the economic concerns as well, the fallout, whether it's a significant event or not. So as I mentioned, I think there's a real link as we move down the road of safety and security. I think they're interwoven. And it's not just large fixed sites, as this addresses. The maritime is an interesting perspective on that. I know a number of folks are still wrestling with that, especially the Coast Guard.
Very good.
I'll give a different twist on this because it just happened. Talk about mobile. How about sea life? You know, we've got protections. A lot of people don't know that about sea life on flying close to them for manned aircraft and, you know, their aircraft, period. It's a significant issue right now in many parts of this country where we're getting the calls from the local communities, we're getting the calls from the mayors and the governors of people buzzing sea lions, for example. And you know, you may kind of joke about it, but they actually leave their pups on the shore and they don't come back. They die. And this is just responsible operation. And, you know, I think this is, how am I tying this back to, you know, ships? You know, really, do you really need to be operating within a couple thousand feet of that ship that's you know, coming, unless it's your own ship and you're using it for fish spotting for your own purposes or something like that. There's legitimate uses, but maybe the answer isn't how to control or to, you know, create a particular system. It's just about us understanding that we got to think about where we're operating these things and the effect that we're having on the environment around where we're operating. And that's going to take some time. I remember when they first put cameras on these. I think most of us remember that in this room. You know, they were banned from the gyms, they were banned from the bathrooms, and everybody. And now think of all the places we go around with these things on us. And now you can hack into them and turn them on, and we don't even talk about it anymore. But you know, it's just about us getting used to how do we deal with this technology, where's the appropriate places to be, and we need a little bit of our code of ethics and thinking about that, how we operate them. And then I think the mobile site issue will come along with it.
Very good. You know, this question around how we look at the integration into society and sort of the societal impacts brings to mind something that came up at the prior panel. I think Winsome Linford had been talking about noise. And I know just from talking to some of the folks in the industry, as they're thinking about how to have technologies that are quieter in terms of drone operations. I don't know if anybody wants to speak to that concern, because I can see that as they populate and become a larger volume, that could be an area of concern that we'll have to address.
I agree. Again, as these things get more and more, as they're more and more local, that's something that the neighbors call about and the people are working on. I know that people are spending a lot of time working on that in terms of moving people in UAS. Not sure, are we going to have to change the name of a UAS when people are in it? Unpiloted? Unpiloted?
Remotely piloted.
Remotely piloted, even though there's people in there.
Lunchtime tomorrow.
Yeah.
Lunchtime
they're gonna
tomorrow, all
solve
these
it,
questions
yeah.
will
They're
be
going to
answered.
brainstorm the
But
name.
every aspect of, everything's fair game, right? So what we're looking for is safe integration and fairly ubiquitous integration if you want to do delivery. And so what are the barriers to that? And if there's a barrier, folks are working on a technology fix. Either, you know, there are regulatory fixes, but there are a lot of these things can be and will be fixed over time. Maybe they won't be silent, but, you know, my car is nearly silent, and who would have thought that? So
I think there's a parallel in the Brian can speak to this even way better than I can, but in more traditional aviation, as we've been trying to implement next gen, one of the most obvious starting points is something called performance-based navigation, PBN, new procedures in and out of airports that are highly fuel efficient. They save miles. They make a scheduled operation much more predictable. Turns out we didn't take the time early on to talk to the communities around the airports. So even if it's less noise overall, you're going to be they're putting aircraft over the same houses every single day. Sometimes just seeing an airplane, you think you hear it, even if you don't necessarily hear it. I think it's called visual noise. And anyway, I think that one of the lessons is you can't underestimate the impact that the concerns of the local communities can have, and the ways that they can be mitigated if the conversation starts early and everybody gets a voice in. And then based on that, you know what kinds of technologies you really should start working on.
Yeah, just 2 points. There are certainly certain technologies that are being developed to mitigate noise, but I also think that airspace management can play a big role in mitigating noise just by either spreading traffic out or you know, allowing people to have a bit of a say on where these things are flying. But I would point out that, you know, there are a lot of things in society that we benefit from that do create some kind of a nuisance, right? And if we didn't want any noise on the roads, we wouldn't have cars either. So I think it's really incumbent upon us as industry to prove out the value of UAS technology to members of the public so that they actually want this, they ask for it, and they're willing to accept a little bit of inconvenience that they maybe didn't have before. So.
Great, yeah. The externalities question and how we address that. Brian.
It's an interesting issue. Obviously, airlines have a requirement and should try to reduce the noise footprint. I live in downtown Chicago, and they use large helicopters to lift devices or lift things up on top of buildings. And you know, I look at all of you, and I think that there's probably some of you out there thinking, I can design something that's going to be much quieter than a helicopter, with perhaps 4 smaller blades than one huge, enormous rotor on top of it, that's going to have a net reduction in the noise footprint to deliver the same payload to the top of a building. So there's been some work that was brought up at the Drone Advisory Committee the last time that they met, which is, you know, should in managing these devices, should there, one would think that we could do it in a way where there's a net reduction in risk, there's a net reduction in emissions, there's a net reduction in noise, there's a net reduction in everything that you would see as a negative impact on the environment or to society, that you can design into the devices that you're going to build and operate. So with noise, it's important to understand too that while I do live in a high rise in Chicago, and I heard the weed eater outside my apartment, I walked out on a balcony, so there was a drone at the 28th floor flying around. Pretty small footprint of noise, but it's something that alerted me that I don't normally hear this, so let me go take a look. And you know, so there's a lot of work to be done in noise mitigation.
Did you shoot
all
it down?
Aspects. I called the ex-com.
That was part of her test. I should have told you.
No, I didn't.
So I think that's a really interesting summary because it really talks about what the series of questions are and the challenge space for which we have to think about. some innovative ways and what to solve for, sort of that, what is the issue that we're trying to solve and how do we address it. At the same time, I think we're just about finished with our time at the panel. I really wanted to thank everybody for participating, making time this afternoon, having an active dialogue and discussion. I know it doesn't end here. We have a full couple of days here ahead of us, and really excited about the turnout and the broad participation as we think about this very important work of safely and effectively, efficiently, and securely integrating drones into the national airspace. So thank you very much.